The night pressed close to the cabin like a held breath, the kind that made even the pines seem to listen. And Ruth Calder stood just inside her doorway with her fingers wrapped around the iron bolt, feeling the old ache in her wrist where the winter had once split her skin open, and the years had never fully stitched it back together. Her eyes fixed on the man across the threshold as the lantern light trembled between them and painted his shadow long and crooked across the floorboard she had laid with her husband's hands before the fever took him. She did not flinch when he said it, did not blink or step back or plead like women were expected to do when a man with a gun and a mean smile leaned too close. She only let the corner of her mouth rise in something that was not quite a smile and not quite madness either. And that was when he told her, low and certain, that she would regret this, that locking herself in with him outside in the dark beyond would be the last foolish choice she ever made. And for a moment the words echoed through her like a stone dropped down a well, stirring memories she kept buried deep beneath the dust and the quiet. Memories of a different man's voice, steady and warm, promising that the land would be theirs if they endured long enough. Ruth had endured, through hunger that made her hands shake as she cooked, through loneliness that crept into her bed like cold, through the slow realization that the world did not care whether a widow lived or died as long as the cattle kept moving west and the rail lines kept crawling forward. And now she stood here with her spine straight and her fear folded neatly away where it could not betray her, studying the man who had come to claim what he believed was owed to him. His name was Elias Crow, though most folks just called him Crow, and he had the look of someone the frontier had sharpened instead of worn down, with eyes like dark glass and a jaw that never seemed to unclench. And he smelled of leather, smoke, and the faint copper tang of old violence, the kind that never quite washed off no matter how often a man dunked his hands in a river. He had ridden up at dusk, his horse lathered and impatient, carrying a folded paper with a red stamp that meant nothing to Ruth because papers had never kept her warm or fed her when the storms came. And he had spoken of debts and deeds and arrangements made between men long dead, as if her husband's bones were not already cold enough without them being used as leverage. Ruth had listened, because listening was something she had learned to do well. But when he stepped forward without invitation and let his gaze travel the length of her cabin as though measuring what could be taken and what could be burned, something old and hard settled into her chest, a resolve forged the night she buried Thomas Calder alone beneath a sky so wide it felt like judgment. And she realized then that survival was not always about running or yielding, but sometimes about choosing the moment to stand perfectly still. The bolt was heavy, scarred from years of use, and as her hand closed around it, she felt the weight of every night she had slept with a rifle across her knees, every morning she had risen before dawn to break ice and tend the goats, every whispered prayer she had sent up only to be met with silence. And when Crow saw the decision settle into her eyes, his smile shifted, sharpening, as if he were pleased by the challenge, as if he had come not just for land but for the chance to remind himself that he was still the kind of man who could take what he wanted. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, telling her that men like him always got what they came for, that the law rode slow in these parts, and mercy even slower. And Ruth thought of the ridge behind the cabin where the ground dropped away steep and unforgiving, of the trap she had set for wolves 2 winters ago, of the way desperation could make any creature careless. And she wondered if fate, that old silent watcher, had finally grown bored enough to lean in and see how this would end. Outside, the wind rose and rattled the eaves, carrying with it the distant howl of something wild and hungry. And for a heartbeat, Ruth felt the ghost of fear brush her ribs, the simple human instinct to open the door and let the danger pass through instead of daring it to linger. But she did not move, because fear had taken too much from her already, and she would not give it one more inch of ground. Crow's hand hovered near his holster now, casual as a man reaching for a cup, and the lantern flame flickered, throwing his features into sharp relief, the lines around his mouth etched by choices he had never apologized for. And Ruth realized with a clarity that surprised her that whatever happened next would mark her forever, that there would be no going back to the quiet routine she had built to keep herself sane, no pretending that solitude was the same as peace. She met his gaze and let her smirk deepen just enough to unnerve him, just enough to make him wonder what a woman alone could possibly be so certain of. And then, Slowly, deliberately, she slid the bolt into place, the love iron ringing out like a bell struck in a small church, a sound that sealed more than a door as the night closed in around them, and the man outside drew a sharp breath, his certainty faltering for the first time as Ruth Calder stood alone in the lamplight, heart pounding, knowing that whatever regret waited on the other side of this choice was already on its way. The bolt's echo still hung in the cabin when Crow's certainty curdled into something uglier, and Ruth felt it before she saw it. The shift in the air when a predator realizes the ground beneath him is not as solid as he believed, because outside the wind rose hard and sudden, and his horse screamed as one of its legs dropped into the narrow pit Ruth had dug weeks earlier and disguised with snow and pine needles, a trap meant for wolves, but never truly meant for them, and Crow cursed and spun, back toward the yard, his control cracking just enough for Ruth to move, her body remembering every practiced motion from long nights rehearsing survival, her hand finding the rifle mounted above the hearth, the wood worn smooth by Thomas's grip and now warmed by hers. And as she stepped into the doorway, the lantern behind her cast her shadow long and steady across the dirt like a woman twice her size. Crow yanked his horse free with brute force and rage, but the animal was lame now, rearing and useless. And in that moment Ruth saw what he really was beneath the leather and threats. Just another man whose power depended on momentum and fear, both of which had abandoned him. And when he turned back toward her with murder in his eyes, she did not raise the rifle to fire, but held it firm and low, her voice cutting through the wind as she told him this land had already taken one man she loved, and it would take no more for his pride. Crow laughed then, sharp and brittle, telling her she was alone and always would be, that widows ended forgotten and buried shallow, and the words struck deep because they echoed the very fears she carried like stones in her pockets. But instead of sinking her, they steadied her, reminding her that she had already faced the worst kind of ending and lived on the other side of it. The standoff stretched, seconds dragging like hours, until hoofbeats sounded from the ridge, slow and deliberate, and Crow stiffened as a second rider emerged from the brick trees, an older man with a star pinned dull against his coat, Sheriff Boone, who had lost a son to men like Crow and remembered every face, every debt written, not on paper but in blood. And when Boone took in the scene, the trapped horse, the armed widow, the man whose name had crossed his desk too many times, his hand rested easy on his own gun, not in threat but in promise. Crow tried to speak his way out, tried to reclaim the smooth authority that had carried him across counties, but their night no longer belonged to him, and Boone's voice was quiet when he told Crow to drop his weapon and step away. The law finally catching up, not because it was swift, but because fate had grown patient. Ruth watched as Crow's shoulders sagged, watched the moment he understood that regret was not something waiting for him in the future, but something already clawing at his throat. And when Boone bound his hands and led him away, Crow looked back once, his eyes burning with a mix of hate and disbelief, as if he could not fathom that a woman he had dismissed had been the one to end his run. When the yard finally fell silent and the wind eased, Ruth stood alone again, the rifle heavy in her arms, and for the first time since Thomas died she felt something loosen inside her chest. Not relief exactly, but space. Room enough to breathe without bracing for the next blow. Dawn came slow and pale, light spilling over the mountains and touching the cabin like a benediction, and Ruth stepped outside to tend the injured horse because cruelty had never been her way, realizing as she worked that survival did not have to harden into bitterness, that strength could coexist with mercy without undoing either. Weeks later, when Boone returned with official papers bearing her name and the land confirmed as hers, Ruth buried them beneath a loose floorboard, knowing true ownership was earned every day through endurance and care, not ink and seals. And as spring thawed the ground she planted, again her hands deep in the soil, her heart no longer closed off to the possibility that fate, having tested her, might yet offer something gentler. And if this story stirred something in you, if you felt the pull of grit, destiny, and the quiet courage it takes to stand your ground when the world tells you to yield, then remember, there are many more tales waiting just beyond the horizon here at Western Destiny Tales, where every story honors the hard choices and unbreakable spirits that shape the frontier. So ride with us, subscribe, and keep the fire lit for the next chapter of fate.